We can begin. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the latest installment of the Prague Security Studies Institute Space Security Guest Lecture Series. My name is Jana Robinson, and I serve as the Managing Director of the Institute. Our core mission is to help safeguard and strengthen the freedoms and democratic institutions of nations in Central and Eastern Europe and beyond. And the Institute also seeks to eliminate emerging threats to the transatlantic alliance and other partners globally, especially in the economic and financial and space domains. This Space Security Guest Lecture series began as a collaborative initiative with the Faculty of Social Sciences at Charles University, and it continues to serve as a key platform to raise awareness of the strategic, technological, and geopolitical challenges facing the space domain today. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture entitled Nuclear Fears in Orbit: Governing Space Security in a Time of Rising Tensions. The recently released Worldwide Threat Assessment by the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency highlights significant concerns regarding Russia's pursuit of a satellite capable of carrying a nuclear device, which would pose a substantial threat to global satellite infrastructure and violate international treaties. It also mentions the 2024 veto by Russia of a UN resolution that reaffirmed the 1967 Outer Space Treaty's ban on the placements of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in space. This evening, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Jessica West, Senior Researcher at Project Ploughshares, a Canadian institute at the forefront of international disarmament and space security research. Dr. West will guide us through what we actually know versus what we fear or assume about these developments. She will examine the signals being sent and assess the health of current multilateral governance frameworks. Amid rising geopolitical tensions, she'll explore the sobering questions: what does sustainable security in orbit look like? And how close are we to crossing a perilous line? Please join me in welcoming Dr. West.
Hi, Jana. Thank you so much for having me. As a researcher based in Canada, I echo the concerns of PSSI about maintaining that transatlantic security partnership, and also concerns about the current state of the world and where we fit in. So let's get back to 2024. The media frenzy, the rumor mills are spreading. Those of us who follow issues of space security think there's got to be a mistake. There's no way that American lawmakers are being briefed on a nuclear weapon potential in outer space. It must be a nuclear-powered anti-satellite capability, like a jammer that fit with existing context and what we knew related to open source information. But then the gut punch hit. American officials clarified their belief that Russia is developing a weapon capable of destroying swaths of satellites by unleashing a nuclear blast in orbit. And I think the part that struck out most at this moment wasn't just the unbelievability of the threat, it was the uncertainty of what we knew. The way confusion spread so quickly, the not knowing of what was real, what was actually a danger, what was being understated, what was being overstated, and the realization that the unthinkable may become thinkable. There's a lot we still don't know about the threat itself. The United States government has pointed as evidence to a lone satellite in a very lonely orbit, one where radiation is thought to be too high for common purposes. We don't know what it's doing there. Russia claims it's conducting research on radiation effects. The US claims, well, there is a lot of radiation, but not enough to warrant doing research there. We don't know if the satellite's part of a research program, if it's part of a weapons program, if it's a pet project of an obscure official or department within the government that goes nowhere. What we do know is that the satellite itself did not carry a nuclear weapon, thank goodness, although the United States claims it had a dummy warhead. We also know that whatever it seemed to be doing didn't work so well because it's now tumbling through orbit and out of control. But I think the most important thing we know is that the foundations of space security and governance in outer space are cracking. And that's the key point that I want to make today, is that renewed fears of nuclear capabilities in space and concerns of a nuclear crisis are tearing at the foundations of space governance. I'm going to make this point through a series of themes. The first is that space security really is built on nuclear restraint. And so if that crumbles, so does security in outer space. The second is that this restraint, as we have heard in the threat assessment, is clearly under stress. The stakes are higher than ever. Our uses of space today far outweigh anything in the past, and this is a crisis not only for great powers, but for the entire world. Governance is incredibly thin. We have a long and solid track record of core principles in outer space, but we haven't moved forward on putting those into practice very well. When you put all of these together, I think the key takeaway is that the buildup of nuclear tensions that we're seeing now is a symptom of wider governance failings. So to dive into that, let's begin with where that nuclear space foundation came from and how it shaped our current strategies and approaches to governance in outer space. When you look back to how we came up with the rules that we have in outer space, especially the Outer Space Treaty, the first point is really that the drive to restraint, the drive to maintaining peace and arms control really came from nuclear fears. And so the first ban that we have related to outer space comes from nuclear testing and the devastation that it wrought on the outer space environment. And that's the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which bans nuclear weapons tests in space as well as in other areas. And that restraint, in many ways, served as a core foundation for the Outer Space Treaty, which lays out the principles by which every state is expected to conduct its activities in space. And that includes a ban on putting, orbiting, stationing, or placing nuclear weapons in space, as well as the existing restriction on testing them. That has been the core arms control restraint that has underpinned security relations in space. And from there, we also see the role of space as restraint in space is nuclear space. So I've been lucky enough to have the chance to look through history and do a really deep dive into bilateral nuclear arms control agreements, which sounds dry to some people, but for some reason I really enjoyed it and found it exciting. And what's fascinating is how often space features in these agreements. And so you have commitments not to interfere with satellites that are used for monitoring nuclear weapons programs, satellites that are used for detecting launches, and other forms of restraint in space that are really key to maintaining nuclear stability on Earth. And that further pins together these two domains, the space and the nuclear. And then you also have agreements related to nuclear weapons, not to put missile interceptors in space, because that would destabilize nuclear deterrence. And so you see these two domains co-evolving in a way that's aimed at promoting stability and restraint. But it's always been a strained restraint. I mentioned the fact that the first ban in space was really the testing of nuclear weapons in space. Well, that's because it came from a lesson that was hard learned. There was eager, enthusiastic, if you will, testing of nuclear weapons in space at the dawn of the space age. And the most famous test is probably Starfish Prime in 1962, when the United States detonated a thermonuclear warhead about 400 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean. I am not one that's great with measurements, so to give you a visualization, it's about roughly where the International Space Station flies today. The effects were devastating. The bomb was 100 times more powerful than the first atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It disabled 8 of 24 operational satellites, which was not the intention. It created worsening radiation in key orbits in outer space, making the environment more difficult to use. And so the key lesson from that test is that nuclear weapons in space weren't just satellite killers, they were potentially space killers, making space itself unusable. So that's what drives restraint. No one wants to ruin the environment on which they depend. But there's always been efforts to skirt the rules, to find ways to exploit nuclear capabilities um, in other areas. Some examples include the Russian FOBS program. FOB stands for Fractional Orbital I'm forgetting what FOB stands for, but it was essentially a system that that was intended to place nuclear warheads into low Earth orbit for delivery anywhere on Earth by falling from orbit. And so they didn't they weren't placed in orbit. They weren't stationed. They didn't orbit. They didn't create a full circle of the Earth. They were just sort of put in space and expected to plop down. So the idea was like, that doesn't violate the outer space. Here's a way we can exploit a loophole. There's also been experimentation and research on nuclear-tipped anti-satellite weapons that would destroy or disable satellites through nuclear blasts. And so this idea is not new. There's been efforts to create nuclear-powered space weapons. So Project Excalibur in the United States was a concept for and there's been extensive studies on the effects of nuclear detonations in space and also how to withstand those kinds of detonations. So really, where we are today is a culmination of many decades of restraint and straining against those restraints, including walking away from prohibitions on missile defense interceptors in space. So if we take this long history and we fast forward today, I think it's clear that the same impulse or this desire to escape restraint has never really gone away. We're seeing it resurfacing today. It's very much something that we cannot ignore because the fear is real, but the context is even more precarious and complex than it was in the past. And that's because the space nuclear entanglement today is so much deeper than it was in the early days of the Cold War. Today, the technology and the components for nuclear command and control and communications, the ability to use nuclear weapons, depends on assets in space. It runs through satellites. Um, Policies and doctrines related to nuclear planning increasingly talk about space because they're so interconnected technologically, but the strategies are also linked. And so we have, because of the technology being linked, there's a concern that the use of anti-satellite capabilities, any type, not just nuclear, could be used to trigger nuclear escalation, especially if it affected key capabilities that are needed to maintain a nuclear deterrent. At the same time, to deter attacks or interference with those critical space systems, key states, including the the United States and Russia, they've extended nuclear deterrence for space. And so there's policies in place that say if there's an existential risk to the country that takes place in space, that maybe takes place through the targeting of satellites, we reserve the right to respond with nuclear weapons. So the deterrence pieces are connected. And finally, I think most people in the audience are probably aware of the growing focus on warfighting in outer space that's been evolving for the last maybe 10 years or so. Space is a warfighting domain, a growing focus on developing defensive as well as offensive capabilities. But I think what is behind all of this is the reality that today space is an existential capability for national survival. And that's where the high stakes of the current crisis really reside, in the notion that it's not just a skirmish, it's not just another capability. We're really talking about the heart of national security. And if you disrupt these capabilities, then you're not just blinding a military, we're risking nuclear war and nuclear escalation, either in orbit or on Earth, or both. I think that's what makes today's development so dangerous. The other major piece of space nuclear uh, cobulation that is in the news is Golden Dome. This is the renewed focus on ballistic missile defense championed by the United States that includes a vision for missile interceptors in orbit that would be able to intercept either missiles being launched from Earth, or as statements increasingly point to, those in space. And you can see how this desire might be linked to growing nuclear fears coming from space. And so I find that these two developments are really mirror images of each other and reflect our current dilemma very well. On the one side, we have a Russian satellite behaving erratically, tumbling through orbit, shrouded in mystery and suspicion. On the other, there's a bold vision in the United States to place interceptors in orbit. But both of them are symptoms of a same problem, a growing fear that the other side won't stay restrained, and a willingness to do anything to prevent that fear from materializing. Now, we don't know if Russia's actually pursuing a nuclear weapons capability in space, but if it is, one reason that seems logical is through an effort to undermine American superiority in space, which is based on an increasingly resilient, layered, and commercial presence in space that's hard to defeat through ordinary means. It's hard to um, deter the capabilities that stem from it. Um, and it's hard to hold it at risk. And so nuclear weapons in space might be one way to hold all of those capabilities at risk simultaneously, simply by destroying space or just destroying large swaths of satellite. But Golden Dome is the American counter logic. We can see that as an attempt to be immune to this kind of big capability or this kind of threat through a space-based shield, if you will. Whether or not that's technologically plausible, I think is a different lecture for a different occasion. But together we have this strategic echo chamber of wanting to hold each other at risk and evade that risk. And that's where we have the roots of an arms race. And I think that's the risk that we face right now, is an escalating nuclear arms race in outer space. And it's easy to think of this in abstract terms. You know, space seems far away. Space is filled with satellites and not people. Um, a lot of this is rooted in, abstract concepts of military doctrine and technological systems that can be hard to understand. And so I'm showing you this slide, which I put together earlier in the year for a different talk when I was reflecting on how much space has changed from the time that I first started working on it in 2006 to today. I'll ask you to kindly not do the math and just focus on the drastic changes that we've seen unfold in orbit over the last blank number of years. So when I first started working on space security with the Space Security Index at Project Ploughshares, we used to be able to have a chart, a table listing every satellite in orbit because they were under 100. Today, I'm seeing numbers between 11 and 14,000. The reality is that the number of satellites in orbit changes on almost a weekly basis to the point where it's hard to keep up. There used to be only about 30 countries with satellites. Now there's more than 80. Global space spending has ballooned because space has so many services that are linked to Earth. This is because launch costs, the cost of putting things in orbit, has fallen drastically, which means we can do more with space than we could do in the past. I do remember that first very exciting single commercial Earth observation satellite in orbit, and now there's over 700 flying overhead. And in 2006, we really weren't talking about the moon. And now in 2025, there's expectations that there could be 12 or more lunar missions. And the point I want to make here is that this threat that we're facing and the crisis, it affects all of us. It affects everybody who's gathering online today. It affects everyone you know. It affects everyone around the world because we are so unbelievably dependent on outer space. And so the point is that dealing with the current crisis, dealing with growing insecurity and military competition and nuclear tensions, it's not optional. Governance is not optional. It really is about our collective survival. So, how did we get here? We have a treaty that goes back to 1967. I think it's still a highly relevant and valuable treaty with tremendous principles that are rooted in trying to make outer space, I would say, a better place than we have on Earth. Um, there's been decades of United Nations meetings and discussions on how to add on to these principles, particularly from the arms control perspective, since the only arms control measure or core peace measure is really the nuclear ban. And even with that, we're still talking about a potential nuclear crisis in space. So, what happened? I think that what we have put in place is incredibly valuable, but in many ways, it's the surface of governance, it's the illusion, because we failed to put it into practice. And so, we do have a treaty that bans nuclear weapons in orbit, and we have commitments. I would say it's one of the most fundamental commitment that states have made when it comes to space, but it offers no means of verification, no way of enforcing it, no definition of what counts. We've seen from the past efforts to skirt the formal wording of the treaty. No way of dealing with a crisis, of having formal conversations about what we might suspect and sorting them out. And so this moment is really pulling back the curtain on how thin governance currently is. Our rules are excellent, but our ways of putting them into practice are lacking. Trust is very thin, transparency is minimal, and diplomacy is fragmented. Sorry, I keep going back and forth. Um, in many ways, I think space is governed by promises that are on paper, but we don't have robust processes to put them into practice. And that to me is kind of the heart of how we got here. Putting those practices into creating them and acting on them is also being held hostage by political gridlock. And so, Yana, you mentioned earlier um, a key UN Security Council resolution. I'll fill in a little bit of the story of what happened here. Following the rumors, the fears, the concerns, the frenzy about a potential Russian intention to develop a capability to put nuclear weapons in orbit, the United States and Japan went to the Security Council, which is the body tasked with the most fundamental peace and security issues that the world faces. That in itself is a little bit jaw-dropping because it's a huge diplomatic escalation, and I think points to the fact that we don't have other appropriate forums for dealing with space governance concerns or space security concerns. And so the resolution put forward called on states to reconfirm the existing commitment not to put nuclear weapons in space and not to develop those capabilities. So the existing clause in the Outer Space Treaty is about putting them in orbit, not about deploying them. That was vetoed by Russia. In some ways, it's not really surprising because everybody knows that the resolution is part of an accusation at Russia, which it denies. Russia, in turn, had its own resolution asking for states to commit not to put any weapons in space, not just nuclear. That, in turn, was vetoed by the United States. But this pattern of having dueling resolutions, dueling approaches to the problems that we face is decades long. Ever since the 1980s, there have been twin tracks to space security that never cross and never converge and never lead to progress. And so in the UN General Assembly, we have states that want to pursue norms of behavior. And then we've had a long-standing proposal by Russia and China to ban all weapons in space. And we keep going in circles and going in circles because we can't get out of this gridlock. And so how do we move forward? I think it's time to really focus on the machinery of space security, the ability to put our excellent principles and our very good intentions into practice, and to hold each other to account. I think we are severely lacking in transparency tools um, that would be easy to implement. Things like pre launch notifications, real time status sharing. We lack verification mechanisms or even um, the way to exchange information more accurately about what's in space so that we can allay fears, reassure others. We lack basic crisis communications capabilities that were so important during the Cold War, hotlines and standard sets of space diplomacy protocols for preventing and responding to crises. On norms of behavior, those are starting to evolve, but we lack definitions, prohibitions, and clear articulation of what is and is not acceptable. And we don't have our accountability frameworks. How do we attribute things in outer space without it being a he said, she said situation? How do we respond? How do we investigate when there's accusations or serious security concerns that are raised? These are all things that exist in other domains of security, specifically through arms control mechanisms, but they don't exist when it comes to outer space. And I think building this machinery is really the next step on space governance. How do we get there? There's no shortage of meetings at the United Nations grappling with this. We've recently viewed or had the opportunity to participate in an open-ended working group that was aimed at developing norms. So we're on the practical or the practice side of space governance. That ended in a stalemate. Surprise, surprise. Then we also had recently a group of governmental experts, so a smaller group of about 25 countries working on legal approaches, going back to our twin streams, legal approaches to preventing an arms race in outer space. It arose with the report, but the report laid out many, many things that have to be done, including definitions, verification, communications protocols, and basically everything that I had on my previous slide. And now we have a new working group that is trying to bring these strains together. Um, it's not going well. I will say that the first formal meeting turned into a non-meeting with basically a half day, maybe a half day total of open discussion because states couldn't agree on an agenda or a program for how the meetings will unfold. That's not very optimistic. But my point isn't that it's not valuable. I think that these talks are essential, but in some ways we've deferred or relied too much, perhaps, on the United Nations coming up with all of the answers or rescuing us from our own problems and risk of demise. And the point I want to make here is there's really a role for individual states, for civil society, for regional bodies to start working on some of those practical issues that I outlined, to test what might work, to think about what the structures and institutional frameworks might look like, and to bring those to the United Nations. But the idea that everything and all of the answers will come from a single body, I think, is misplaced. That body needs the rest of us to be pulling our weight, to be doing the work, to be coming up with the solutions and engaging with one another and building the political will that's needed for progress. And so I began my talk with a leak, this moment of confusion last year, of disbelief and quiet dread. And it's a reminder that the unthinkable can still happen, that it's poking through the surface as we speak. We've seen that space and nuclear weapons have always been connected, both in terms of the technology, but also existentially from the perspective of risk and deterrence. From Starfish Prime to FOBs overhead to Golden Dome and a tumbling weird satellite. It's clear that space has never been a sanctuary. It's always been strategic and it's always been linked to nuclear capabilities. Today, the strategic importance of this domain is only deepening. Our reliance on space is unprecedented. The governance tools that we've built, however, are underpowered, under institutionalized, and a little bit thin. The Outer Space Treaty still stands. Its principles are clear, but the principles alone don't prevent escalation. They don't verify intentions, they don't reduce ambiguity, and they don't manage crises. So I think the challenge before us today isn't to reinvent governance. It's to put what we have into practice, to make it more real. And that means building machinery for transparency, for verification, for communication, for de-escalation. It means investing in diplomacy and in restraint and in the architectures that make those possible. Because the unthinkable hasn't gone away, it's just gotten harder to see in some ways. So, what we do now, and I think how seriously we take what Jana described as a crisis, will determine whether or not space remains a shared domain in the future or is ruined by some of our worst instincts. I will stop there and thank everybody for listening. And also realize that I went a little under time and the desire not to go over time, but that means we have a lot of opportunity for discussion.
No, Jessica, thank you, and that's a wonderful overview. I encourage everybody who wants to pose a question, please use the Q&A section or the chat. And I see Victoria came. I don't know if you can see the questions. Would you like me to read them out? Maybe that's a good idea, just to so that everybody can be on the same page here. So I think the bottom line of what Victoria is asking is that the major powers are not acting in good faith, especially Russia stopped the convo in April conversation because they said they didn't support UNGA resolution that called for discussing norms of behavior. So how do we go ahead with these actors willfully blocking conversations? And maybe I would add to that personal questions like how should we involve the mid-size spacefaring nations, and what is their role, if any?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great point. I'll take one step back and then I'll answer that question. And the one step back I'm going to say is that the nuclear issue is not going to be discussed at the open-ended working group, simply because it is either about creating norms related to the Outer Space Treaty, which already bans nuclear weapons in space, or a new arms control treaty that would ban weapons in space. And so I don't see the nuclear issue being a focus in the discussion. Where I do see the link isn't developing the practices or the mechanisms to put the treaty into practice in an arms control context. And so that is grappling with things like definitions, grappling with mechanisms for information sharing, for pre-notification, things that can prop up that existing commitment in the Outer Space Treaty a little bit better. Dealing with bad faith, this was one of the most frustrating experiences of my life. Every day I got up at 4 a.m. because I was in Canada, logging on to the UN system. It was not even televised. It was only UN radio. And so I would put my headset on and hear silence. And I didn't know, is the meeting not happening or is my system not working? Because I can't see what's going on in the room. And inevitably, for day after day after day, the meeting would be closed because a certain state, Russia, insisted that it was not a formal meeting because there was no agenda and no agreement on what the formal meeting would look like, and really got into a chicken and egg. To see an entire week go by in this fashion was astounding, quite frankly, and I think reaches in many ways a new low. So what do we do? I think we go back to the connections and the discussions outside of the United Nations that help pave the way for political will in the formal setting. I'm optimistic that the current intercessional informal discussions are helping. And I do think there's a big role for middle powers to play. Jana, I'll point to you. Brazil, about 2 years ago, they started talking about themselves as a middle ground state, which I thought was really interesting because we usually talk about middle power, especially, I don't know if Europe does, but I'm Canadian, and middle power has been our identity for a very long time. It's our sense of self-worth and somewhat importance. And it's the idea that we can help move things beneath the level of high-level strategy, that we can help nudge each side together. And I think the concept of middle ground is really powerful here, because it's an idea of acting as a bridge, being able to communicate across divides and conversations. I think it's harder to do now. I think we're in an era where the pressure to be on one side or another is growing stronger. And there are very few states that are going to be able to successfully bridge that divide. On space, I think some of them are Brazil, Egypt, somewhat Europe, maybe somewhat Canada, but I do see us sort of more on one side of the conversation than the other. And I think this is where civil society really comes in handy. When you look back to how we function, and I say we because civil society has been my professional home for 20 years, a lot of that was about having ties and bridges and information exchange across geopolitical divides. And I think resurrecting that way of working at a non-state level is incredibly valuable. So, Victoria, I have not booked my flight to Geneva for July because I'm not 100% certain that we're actually going to have a formal substantive meeting. Um, what will I do in the meantime? I think it's continuing to work in the background and finding ways to frame and act practically on some of the issues that we're facing. Because when the moment comes, we have to be ready. When the political opening arises, we need to have our plans and our processes in place. It's a great question. We can act in good faith. I guess that would be my answer.
Yes. Well, thank you. I will go a little bit back in history, and then I put Catherine Melbourne has a question here. Um, at a time when you mentioned originally the Soviet Union and both the United States, they tested weapons, and they realized it's a bad idea, and the Clay Moltz mentioned in the past that. For example, the LGBT treaty, it was not the result of successful arms control, but rather the desire to prevent damage to then passive military systems, right? So they had these real-time experiences. Well, what about a new important players in this regard, namely China? So Catherine is asking, where do you see China fitting in the nuclear deterrence in space as they're rapidly growing their presence and are also increasingly threatened by a nuclear weapon in orbit as well?
Yeah, China's an interesting category. I love that you brought up Clay Moltz, his line about space being too important for war fighting because we're so dependent on it. And now I think the story has shifted somewhat since he wrote that. Space is such an existential dependency that we seek to hold it at risk. Um, as we were saying in our conversation before we got started, as that ultimate blackmail, if you will, and the ultimate deterrent that we have to threaten others. Um, China is interesting. I'm somewhat familiar with both the nuclear and the space sides of security, and China's been rather quiet. Traditionally, they see themselves as not being at the same level as the United States and Russia, and therefore not having the same obligations as the United States and Russia. But Catherine's question makes the point quite eloquently that China itself is both now a major nuclear and a major space power. Um, my perception is that China learned the hard way about the value of space and the value and the harms of damaging space from their anti-satellite weapons test in 2007, which created a very large debris field, some of which continues to pose threats to operational satellites. I agree. I think China is not in favor of destroying outer space or making that threat because it too depends on it. And it's been very quiet on the Russian issue. Where China's been more vocal is on Golden Dome, where they see this as part of escalating nuclear arms racing because of the fear that if a magical capability to intercept any and all nuclear missiles did arise, it eliminates the ability of a state to respond in kind with a second strike. And so that balance of terror, however horrific it is, disappears. And so that seems to be their primary concern. Um, they abstained from the resolution at the UN Security Council that the US and Japan and 63 other states co-sponsored, calling for states to recommit to the principle of not having nuclear weapons and not to develop them, intended for space. So they're a state to watch. I think they could have a very constructive role um, in sort of walking across this balance and seeing the incentives of both sides, and leaning on certain states not to go down the nuclear route just because everyone's dependent on space and everyone needs space to continue into the future. But they've been rather quiet. Mind you, I would take an abstention over a negative vote. They didn't explain their vote, so.
Thank you. Well, the next question leads to the Russia-China coordination or even collaboration, potentially. And the question is about recent reports of a potential deal between Russia and China to build a nuclear reactor on the moon by 2035. And if that were to happen, what impact would it have on space security? And should we consider it a weapon?
Yeah, this is also a great question. I'm just going to quickly point out Letitia Cesari wrote a great piece last year that goes through some of the safety, security, and sustainability issues, and she talked to the nuclear power issue. It's not just Russia and China. I think many people agree that deeper space exploration is not going to be possible without nuclear power. And it's a growing interest. It's not something I follow closely. I will point out, though, that it's another area where we do have governance in terms of principles. And so the UN General Assembly, in addition to the Outer Space Treaty, has adopted 4 other treaties, as well as a series of principles, one of which is about nuclear power in space and how to do it in a way that is safe and sustainable. And so we can fall back on that. The question to me is, how well are we using it? Do we have processes in place to review and make sure that we're adhering to those principles? Could it be a weapon? I think any nuclear reactor, as we're seeing in Ukraine, could somehow be a weapon. I am wary about labeling everything a weapon. I think it can detract from some of the more serious and plausible scenarios that we face. But that's a really great example that points to this linchpin that we often grapple with in space, which is on the intersection of safety and sustainable and security, and how they all affect one another. And so the safety of a nuclear reactor would also be a security issue in that sense. But I don't think it's nefarious. I think we're going to come up with a lot of new technologies and capabilities that are going to be needed if the desire to sustain deep space exploration and human life beyond Earth is serious.
Great, thank you. Well, maybe I'll go back a little bit to your expressed skepticism about the status of the multilateral governance and how the UN really is struggling, if I can translate it in that way. And Julia is asking about what Europe could do in creating a potential bridge, or because I know you mentioned, that could be done potentially in another format. So how, I know a lot of people were proposing different formats of discussions. And then there were also obviously a lot of people who are saying, well, why create another platform? It's money, it's people, so how did you give a thought about like how we can move this forward and get out of that conundrum?
Well, I think recently the Swiss government has made indications that they see themselves or would like to play the role of bridge maker in terms of negotiating across the American and Russian perspectives on space, or maybe the norms and the arms control side. And so I think there's a role for sort of track 1, 1.5, and 2 discussions behind the scenes where you can sort out some of the thornier political issues that we don't have time for in formal meetings of the United Nations, when we have a few days to make progress on a bunch of pressing issues. I think space-based missile defense is, it's not the topic I intended to focus on today. I think that is going to be possibly a thorny issue. And so finding a way forward on that. I know Europe's been rather quiet, and I'm assuming that's rather a strategic response in terms of not getting caught in the middle. I think that's an issue that has some potential. Um, there's so much we don't know about that program, its scope, its intentions, the threats, who's in, who's out, including Canada. We're not sure. We're kind of in, but we're not sure how. But I think having discussions on it will be one way forward on some of the space security issues, because it touches on so many. It touches on nukes, it touches on weapons, it touches on missiles. And then I know that there's also civil society organizations who are working on this, not just in like Victoria's in the United States. I'm in Canada, but there's also European ones, the Geneva Center, for instance, that are working on dialogues to flesh out what norms or behaviors associated with close approaches in space might look like. And of course, that links up to the nuclear issue, because, you know, if a satellite is approaching you, what kind of payload does it have? What kind of intention does it have? Is it nuclear? Is it not? And so being able to have dialogues that include different perspectives, I think, will be really important, and not just one-sided. And then bringing those perspectives to diplomats, to states. States also need to serve as champions for certain issues, and then also to the multilateral discussions. I think Europe is great on this because there are nuclear capabilities in Europe. There's also tremendous space capabilities in Europe. And I think the experience that Europe has faced when it comes to insecurity from both is slightly different from the North American experience. So that perspective itself is valuable.
Thank you. And I think that leads me to, for now, the last question. It's about the private sector, and it's asking about whether more involvement about non-state actor and private entities, how that could impact on those government discussion. At least that's how I understand the question. So hopefully I translated it correctly, and it is true. I mean, commercial companies play a bigger role. More investors put their money into space capabilities. Did you have any insights in terms of what their positions has been on any of these issues, especially potentially threatening their viability of existing in outer space, and how they think this could be dealt with?
Yeah, a terrific angle. Anyone with a space company should be tremendously concerned about the potential, not just for a nuclear crisis in space, but direct armed conflict, and even an escalation of gray zone or below the threshold, non-kinetic activity in space in general. The more that we do that threatens the stability and the sustainability of the environment, the harder it is to run a business that depends on space. And those businesses in turn are connected to billions of people around the world. I think they've been less vocal than we would like. I'll point people who are interested. Victoria's here, so Secure World Foundation has a joint statement with commercial operators related to debris and the anti-satellite testing moratorium that was initiated 2 years ago, I think, or 3. That's a great example of, I think, commercial operators trying to be heard on this. I think it's hard because I'm assuming, again, I don't run a business, I'm assuming that your day-to-day business operations are front of mind, and that you expect your operating environment to remain sustainable and free of armed conflict, just like I expect to be able to ride my bike to lunch after this and not find myself in the midst of a war zone. And that's a privilege. I don't think we're in that benign environment anymore. And so I see 2 angles of this. I think the growing commercial role makes it even more important, not just from a financial perspective, but again, because commercial providers are linked to so many people around the world and do so much for us on a day-to-day basis. I think some commercial capabilities might be able to help with some of the challenges that we have when it comes to knowing what's in space, being able to characterize what kind of objects might be. And so commercial space situational awareness, I think, can be helpful. At the same time, my sense is that the last 2 years in particular, commercial itself has become so embedded and so tied into national strategic capabilities that in some ways I fear that the room for having a third space, if you will, similar to civil society that is global, that is globally minded, might not be there. And avenues for sharing information across geopolitical divides that commercial might have been capable of may be getting smaller, and commercial is becoming more politicized, more securitized, and caught up, like many of us, in the geopolitical tug of war in outer space. And so I think there's a lot of potential. I think it's probably hard for commercial operators on a day-to-day basis to pay attention, but they should. And I think we also need to be mindful of how we can create spaces for information sharing, be it commercial, civil society, or whatnot, that can cut across the divides and maintain really important linkages that build understanding and can slowly, through practice and iteration, build trust and transparency. So yes, please, by all means, get on the bandwagon of security, peace, and arms control in space.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jessica. And hopefully we are doing our piece. We have our 8th Prague Space Security Conference coming up. Hopefully that can facilitate some of those much needed discussion and communications that I think you emphasized during your presentation, that surprisingly some of the basic things we're still lacking, and we really need to keep working on those. So thanks again for your insightful and thought-provoking presentation this evening. And to our audience, thank you for joining us for this latest lecture on our space security. And we look forward to welcoming you soon for continued discussion on the challenges and opportunities facing the future of outer space governments. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks for having me, and best of luck with the meeting. I've been once, and it was terrific.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.